On behalf of WISERD, I'm delighted to introduce our keynote speaker, Dr. Karl Wilding. Karl is Director of the Public Policy at the NCVO, the National Council for Voluntary Organisations. The NCVO's public policy role is a key one, both to the voluntary sector in England and more broadly, and also to the aim of creating a better society. The NCVO champions the voluntary sector and volunteering through a range of core activities, including representing the sector to government, using social research to underline the challenges facing the voluntary sector, and demonstrating the value of voluntary activity in order to inform policy making and practice. And the NCVO also acts to support voluntary organisations by providing them with expert support and advice. Karl joined the NCVO in 1998 and became Head of Research in 2001, and since 2013 as Director of Public Policy, he oversees the NCVO's work on policy, research, partnerships and public services. His research or his professional interests include funding and finance issues in relation to the sector, the relative roles of the state and the voluntary sector, and also the impact of new technologies on voluntary action. Karl is a busy man. He's a board member of Compact Voice, which represents the sector on the Compact, which is the key agreement between the sector in England and the Westminster government, which serves to set out the principles and the ways of co-working between government, and also regards setting funding arrangements, promoting equalities, delivering services, and safeguarding the voluntary sector's independence. Karl also oversees work in relation to the Institute of Volunteering Research, which undertakes work to improve policy and practice and works with a wide range of partners, including the United Nations, the European Commission, Amnesty International, and the Department for International Development. And the Institute is currently doing some very interesting work in relation to social innovation and volunteering in relation to care homes. In addition to all these aspects, Karl also oversees the NCVO's European and international functions. And Karl has a PhD from the University of Leeds, and his research focused on voluntary hospitals in Victorian Britain. And he's currently an honorary visiting fellow at the Cass Business School, the Centre for Charity Effectiveness there. Lastly, he's a trustee for a number of voluntary organisations, including St Albans Centre and Creating the Future, and a non-executive director of Charity Bank. And finally, as the NCVO website attests, he's a prolific, thoughtful and highly readable blogger. So it's all for all those foregoing reasons that I'm delighted to welcome Karl as our keynote speaker this morning, as he talks about the contemporary challenges facing the voluntary sector and the research implications for that. So I'll hand you over to Karl. Thank you very much.
Morning, everyone. I'm going to talk to you, or I'm going to share with you some of our thinking about why we think research matters, and then what some of the challenges are where potentially researchers can help us, and then just thinking a little bit about what the future direction of our sector is. Paul, you sort of bigged me up a bit as a researcher there. I'm not really a researcher. I mean, I haven't been for a long time. Nick runs all that stuff at NCVO now, if I'm being honest. And as such, I don't pretend that everything I say this morning I will have evidence for. And indeed, if you ask me difficult questions at the end, it's almost certainly the case that I won't have any of the answers. So as my American cousins would say, I don't have any answers, I'm a non-profit. These are quite challenging times for many voluntary organisations at the moment. It feels to me like we're in a period where we've moved from almost a period where it was generally accepted that voluntary action, volunteering, giving, were good things, and that we should just support them, and that the role of charities was a good thing, and that we should just support them. And it feels now that world is changing a bit. We have some quite different competing moral visions of what a good society looks like. And for some people, that good society might not be focused around voluntary action, or more likely, might not be focused certainly around charities. And as such, if we are going to, whether it's us at NCVO and our sister councils here in Wales, WCVA, if we're going to put forward what our moral vision is of what a good society looks like, I think it's more incumbent upon us than ever to try and back up those visions with evidence and argument. And in that sense, I mean, I feel proud actually and humbled that you've invited me here today, because for us at NCVO, and again the same for WCVA, for many, many years we have invested in research, and we think it's really important to connect researchers with policymakers, practitioners, and indeed we think that our work, it's one of our values that our work should be evidence informed. But it's difficult. It's difficult justifying to boards and chief execs why we should invest in research that has a 3, a 5, possibly even longer timescale in terms of the return on that investment in terms of our knowledge. It's difficult sometimes working with academics when the timescales and the performance indicators that academics have to work with are completely different to the performance indicators that we have ourselves and the timescales that we have to work with. There can be a tendency in our sector to blame you for the difficulty of that working relationship. Glacial timescales and sort of terminology and language that's impossible to understand, and so on. And some of that's true. I've worked with academics for the last 17 years, and I was trying to be one before that myself, not a very good one. And that's why we come here today to talk to you about issues from our perspective. But there's also a problem on our side as well. If you look at some of the things that Cabinet Office and the SRC are doing at the moment around the What Works centres, things like the Alliance for Useful Evidence, one of the things that I think is probably coming through more than ever, and people are listening to more than ever, is that it's not just a supply issue in terms of getting that relationship right, it's a demand issue as well. And one of the things that Nick and I are doing at NCVO is trying to think about how do we get voluntary organisations to demand more from you as our academic colleagues who are doing the sort of research that we need. How do we get them to come to events like this so that you can hear their perspectives and that what they are saying can shape what you are doing on a day-to-day basis, rather than just some sort of dissemination type engagement late on in the research cycle. I would argue to you that it's still the case that too many organisations operate on the basis of gut instinct. And indeed, some campaigning organisations don't like evidence. It presents the world as shades of grey when lots of people want to believe that it's black and white and that we either do A or B. So if there's only one thing that I say today that I hope you find useful, it's the fact that it's not just us at NCVO, but Brian at WCVA. It's an open door in terms of engagement between academia and the sector. We want to encourage those sorts of relationships. It's why we talk to the SRC and other funding bodies all the time. That's the lecture bit over. We definitely don't know what we're doing. As I said at the beginning, these are challenging times. The world is a different place to what it was even just 5 years ago. Someone pointed out that, I think it was either yesterday or the day before, it was 8 years to the day since the iPhone was invented. Crikey, just look at how that sort of changed that bit of the world. So I'll talk to you about some of the things that are bothering us at the minute, some of the things that we're thinking about, and then hopefully I'll give you some prompts for sort of what I think some of the help that we need from the research community in terms of thinking about those issues. The first thing that I wanted to sort of talk about, almost as a sort of a pretext to those future challenges, is that it feels to me at the minute like the thing that I call the voluntary sector, whether you call it the third sector, we could even have a debate about civil society. It feels that it is changing quite a lot, and it's changed quite a lot in my time at NCVO. And there can be, sometimes there can be a sort of a narrative in research circles that all change is bad. that there was a golden age of voluntary action, or there was a golden age of philanthropy, possibly a bit like there might have been a golden age in higher education in about 1960, 1970, and that somehow if we could only get things to go back to how it was before, everything would be great again. One of the biggest changes that I think I'm seeing, which again sometimes I see perceived as just a bad thing, is the blurring of the boundaries between our sector and the public-private sectors and individual households as well. And this diagram that I guess some of you will have seen before from Adalbert Evers and Jean-Louis Lavelle, a really good book called The Third Sector in Europe, talks about how our sector, it's held in a tension field between those other different sectors, and over time our sector expands and contracts according to how it's pulled or pushed by those other sectors. And indeed, I think we've got people at the minute who are talking about the space for civil society being closed down in the UK, but in other places as well, like India, Russia, where we're seeing governments crack down on NGOs, for example. And for me, trying to understand how that space is changing, whether that's that sort of civil society sort of space where we come together and discuss the good society, or even if it's just as simple as what the contours of our sector look like, that for me is one of the defining research challenges of my time. Because it's very difficult to explain to people how our sector is changing because its shape is in flux all the time. But it's also one of the defining issues I would suggest to you of the time, because most of the interesting stuff, for want of a better expression, that's happening in our sector, most of the change is at the boundaries between our sector and those other sectors. Yeah? So at the boundary with business, we're seeing the emergence of social enterprise and the use of market tools and market approaches to management, for example. At the boundary between our sector and government, we're seeing the charitisation of public services, bits of the public sector that are changing their nameplate above the door and becoming part of voluntary sector. We're seeing mutualisation as well, the cabinet office spin-offs, for example. And then at the boundary between individuals and our sector, I think there's a rising tide coming from the millennial generation, and then the generation following them, so-called Gen Z, that is asking quite difficult questions about institutions and what are institutions for. So this sort of phrase, disintermediation. Do we still need those traditional institutions that are part of the landscape? And I think there are research questions about that, and that's what I'm going to try and talk to you about probably in the rest of my presentation. Does that sound all right? Yeah, okay. You can interact. I'm not in London. I'm going to start off just with a few words around technology. This is a cartoon that's meant to be of a non-profit board, and the sentence at the bottom says, "We need to rethink our strategy of hoping the internet will go away." I wonder if I see that in some academic circles as well, actually, when I've talked to some people about blogging and tweeting and so on. I have a provocation for you. Much of the narrative at the moment in public policy circles about our sector and change is all about austerity, and it's all about reduced public spending. And I think that's possibly dominating the research agenda. Austerity is serious and present danger to many voluntary organisations, but it's not the only one. And I wonder if by just focusing on the austerity piece all the time, we're actually ignoring some wider social, political and economic trends that our sector has to deal with. And I would suggest to you that that includes technology. And my provocation would be that I wonder if technology is almost as big a threat to many traditional voluntary organisations as austerity is. Because it is fundamentally changing business models. It's bringing a new set of attitudes with it as well. I think we need the research community to help us understand that. There's some interesting stuff going on in the US, for example. I don't know if you've come across Lucy Bernholtz, who's at Stanford University, who talks about her Disrupting Philanthropy manifesto and how technology is significantly disrupting our business models, how data is going to significantly disrupt the way that we operate. It's going to lead to more efficient and different models of resource allocation. And it's disrupting service delivery as well. What I'm going to try and do in my presentation is just give you some examples of where I think it might be changing things. Guys, you'll make my presentation available later on, so don't worry if you can't read everything. This is an organisation called the Good Gym. Currently based in London, but setting up other examples elsewhere in the country at the minute. And the Good Gym's model basically is using technology. First of all, they want to map the routes of joggers. Yeah? Anyone go jogging? Yeah, a few of you? Okay. So the idea is that we map your route when you go jogging in the morning. And then they've identified, I don't know if it's via social services or not, people who are living on their own, who are isolated. Public services will tell you that if you're on your own and you're isolated, you're much more likely to present at A&E or use a GP. So the idea of the Good Gym is to use voluntary action and get people to stop off on your jogging route and check in on people. Have a quick chat with them, see if they're okay, maybe take them a newspaper. To try and address this issue about isolation and to try and change the way that we're delivering services. I think that's just one of a number of examples that we're seeing. Here's another. When the flooding in the Somerset Levels a couple of years ago was going on, people using crowd mapping or doing crisis mapping to try and identify where the problems are, but also identify where the solutions are. Has anyone come across Ushahidi? Okay? Google Ushahidi. It's a crisis mapping service that has been used in disaster zones where you try and very, very quickly identify where problems are on the ground and then much more rapidly than traditional aid agencies have been able to do, get support to where those problems are. When Ushahidi was something that was developed for developing countries, which is where a lot of natural disasters seem to take place, but they were using Ushahidi in the snowstorms about 4 or 5 years ago in London. Technology is changing how we work. The second thing I want to talk about is about localism and devolution. The antithesis almost of globalisation. An issue I know that you're thinking quite a lot about in WISERD. This first chart, it splits. We have a definition of the voluntary sector where we split it up according to how big organisations are. I'll use these definitions in a few slides. So at one end we have what we would call micro-organisations that have an income of less than £10,000 a year. So typically those sorts of organisations that they will have no staff, predominantly volunteer-led. Small organisations, we say, turn over between £10,000 and £100,000. So that's where you're starting to grow. You might have a secretary for the first time, or you might have a few members of staff. And when you're medium, it's between 100,000 and £1 million. That's where, incidentally, we think lots of the sector is being squeezed by austerity at the minute. It's where you have staff delivering services, but you don't have specialists. So the chief exec is the cook, the cleaner, the bottle washer, and so on. Large, between 1 and 10 million, and then major are 10 million over. Those are the household name charities that you'll be aware of, the NSPCC and so on. All that chart is basically saying is that there are a very small number of large and major charities that absolutely dominate the voluntary sector economy. Almost 80% of the voluntary sector's formal financial resources are controlled, if that's the right expression, by about 5,000 charities. And at the bottom end, half of the sector turns over less than £10,000 a year. And that's just the formal registered bit. Underneath that, if you start to think about civil society and below the radar organisations, we're probably talking in the region of 500,000 organisations. Quite difficult to pin that one down because then you're not talking about organisations anymore, you're talking about volunteering. My point to you is that when you look at research on local government and central government at the minute, there's a lot of research about trust in institutions and size of institutions. And there's work just done by the Institute for Government, for example, that suggests people are much more likely to engage with small and local institutions. Well, the vast majority of those organisations are small. And then my next slide says that the vast majority of those organisations are local as well. We think 80% of organisations that turn over less than £10,000 have a local area of benefit. Even those very large organisations, 1 in 3 we think have a local area of benefit. Why is that important? It feels a bit at the minute that the sun is setting on large national government, that power is being transferred from the centre to the periphery. When I go out and I talk to our members, I'm saying to them, I think that you are more likely to be where power is exercised and where money is spent than probably at any time in the post-war period. I want you as researchers to help me understand, A, is that right? B, what is the impact of that devolution and decentralisation on voluntary organisations? Is it actually just about, is it just a way of shrinking the state? Or is it actually a fundamentally new settlement that organisations can play a bigger part in? An opportunity I say to my members all the time is that we spend lots of time at NCVO talking to national government, just as I'm sure Brian does with the Welsh Assembly, and we spend lots of time joining together different bits of government who don't seem to talk to each other or don't seem to understand each other. I'd suggest that at a local level now, voluntary organisations could clearly play that role of the policy entrepreneur that Jeremy Kendall talked about when he wrote about the voluntary sector. What are the opportunities there? But also, what are the risks? What are the issues in terms of accountability? What can research tell us about that? About those teething pains that are about the shift from, let's call it, a representative to a participative democracy, because we still come across all the time that tension between elected officials and voluntary organisations, and the charge is that neither is legitimate. Elected officials aren't legitimate because the vast majority of people don't vote in local elections, and of course you can accuse voluntary organisations of not being legitimate because nobody voted for them. Yeah. And again, if I was going to throw a challenge out to the research community about these sorts of issues, don't just come and tell me what the problems are. Can you actually help us understand about how to navigate a pathway through? Can you help us think about what the solutions are to encouraging collaboration between those different sectors? Because if I'm right about the blurring of the boundaries, we need to encourage that sort of cross-sector collaboration more, and we need researchers to help us think about what are the solutions are and where does it work. Because one of the things that we do know about devolution is that it's going to be very different in different places. And even in the same places, to quote the Institute for Government, the settlements will have jagged edges. They won't all be sort of ideally sort of overlaying each other. So for national bodies like us that are trying to influence national government, that are trying to think about the fact that some power and some change is structural and it's national, we're going to need the help of the research community more than ever to help us gather what's happening in different places. Because I think there's going to be more experimentation, and you can help us find out what's working. I've been talking about austerity in the economy. This is my next challenge for you. For research to help us understand what a changing economy and a shrinking state, what the impact of that is on voluntary organisations, but also on volunteering and wider communities. This is a chart that's showing income and expenditure for the voluntary sector since 2001. And it's adjusted for inflation. And what essentially this is saying is that round about 2007, we experienced what you might call peak voluntary sector. If you adjust for inflation, income and expenditure have both been flat. We've got lots of anecdotal evidence that need is increasing, and that organisations are having to run faster to sort of stand still, sort of stuff. The quality of some of that evidence base is pretty thin, and it's quite anecdotal. We need the research community to help us unpick a broader sense that need is on the rise, and help us unpick what that means in terms of different service areas, and then almost bring it back together again. We're finding that quite difficult, and it's very difficult to make arguments about the impact of austerity if we can't come forward with good quality evidence about what that impact is. I began by saying that research is more important than ever, and I think on this issue of austerity, research will be more important than ever. It's going to be especially important at local government level. Again, I can see some of you struggling to see my slides. They will be shared with you afterwards. What that basically says is that in the 2 years after the last election, local government in particular reduced the amount that it spent with voluntary organisations based on our data. I am almost certain that we're about to see exactly the same situation again following the 8th of July next week. And we need help in understanding what the implications are, where those changes are hitting. As Paul pointed out, I'm a geographer originally by trade, and one of the things that we know from last time is that the geographical impact of changes in public spending are absolutely not the same everywhere. There is a political economy underlying that issue. And it's going to get worse. This is a fantastic blogger that I follow who writes on management issues called Flipchart Fairy Tales. When I read some of the blogs about management in universities, I think you'd like him. He's good. And this is the best use of a Venn diagram I've seen for a few years, which is meant to be illustrating the promises that politicians were making us in the run-up to the last election. So eliminate the deficit by 2019, which I think has now been turned into surplus by 2018. No tax increases, so a triple lock, no increases in VAT, income tax or national insurance, and then no more cuts to public services. In fact, the NHS has been promised an extra $8 billion at a time when the tax base has been locked down. And Flipchart Fairy Tales, the Rick, the man behind this, says that when you combine all those promises together, we're in La La Land, which is the intersection in the middle. I think we are. I heard a presentation by Paul Johnson last week, the director of the Institute for Fiscal Studies. He was pointing out that next Wednesday, we're going to find out about £12 billion worth of welfare spending reductions. But we're also going to see the first sort of news about how the Chancellor plans to reduce departmental expenditure limits, or DELs, by £30 billion over the course of this Parliament. Johnson's pointed out that by the end of this Parliament, non-protected departments like Transport, Department for Communities and Local Government, will effectively have spending that is 1/3 less than the same point in 2010. Paul Johnson is not a man predisposed to hyperbole. He's an academic, primarily, and his point was that I don't think anybody really understands the size and scale of the spending reductions that were about to come in the next 5 years. And moreover, he points that these are going to be very difficult because in the last 5 years, to use that horrible management phrase, we've picked all the low-hanging fruit. They're going to be even more difficult in the next 5 years. And we know that those are going to hit voluntary organisations in the sense that grants will continue to decline, and I'll come on to that in a minute, but also who's going to pick up the pieces of those reductions. I could go on the spending reductions, but it's not just about spending reductions. And again, this is where possibly, I'm speaking out of both sides of my mouth about the austerity agenda, but part of me sort of would also say it's not just about the financial crisis of 2008 and its aftermath. It's about something much more fundamental than that, which is about demographic change. An ageing population that's more likely to live on its own, a growing population that's placing more demand on public services, and then a more demanding population in the sense that social attitudes are changing and what we expect from our public services is actually increasing. So again, Paul Johnson, I'm almost certain the statistic that he used was that demographic change, just in terms of a growing population and an ageing population, will add 10% to the cost of running the NHS by 2019. If you talk to Sir Simon Stevens, the Chief Exec of the NHS, he's saying that by the end of this Parliament, that £8 billion that's been promised by government is a down payment on the £30 billion that they need just to keep the lights on, without providing any additional services. The NHS is planning efficiency savings of £22 billion by 2019. That would signify a rate of 1.5% a year, every year, over the course of this Parliament, when the most that the NHS has ever managed is 0.3%. I don't wish to sort of try and be sort of too negative and too scary, but just the scale of change that's going to go through the public sector and that's going to hit the voluntary sector over the next 5 years, it's more incumbent than ever that we have to understand that. Next week may or may not help. It's the budget on July the 8th, and I think it may be the case that this will be the latest in a series of budgets that's possibly contributing to that narrative I talked about at the beginning about good and bad charity. So if you're a good charity, you run an air ambulance, and you contribute to the public services, your VAT will be refunded by the Chancellor, for example. If you're one of the volunteer charities that's like the Sea Cadets, you'll benefit from LIBOR fines, but not all charities. We have a business rates review that's just finished. I know business rates and charities and social enterprises has been a long-running issue in Wales. I'm really quite concerned, actually, that that's going to come to the fore next week and that we will localise that. So this issue about localism, devolution, decentralisation, we really need your help in understanding that. The voluntary sector is going to play a much more important part in the delivery of services. Volunteering is going to play a bigger role. The argument is often put forward that we need to think about the resource base of the sector and how do we expand resources coming into the sector. This is my next challenge for you, to think about how that changing resource base for the sector is impacting not just on the resource base, so not just counting the amount of money that comes in and goes out, but how it's changing the culture of organisations, how it's changing their values, and how it's changing the way that they operate. So, for example, there's been a huge amount of public policy interest in social impact bonds over the last few years. This idea that we can shift the resource base of the sector away from what you might call a giving economy to instead a financing economy instead. It's about using the tools of the market and applying the tools of the market for social benefits or social outcomes. Yeah? So you have examples like Peterborough Prison, where voluntary organisations are delivering services and investors are coming in and they're paying for the setup of those services, and whether the investors will get paid or not depends on how successful those voluntary organisations are. In some respects, prison, offending, reoffending, it's a binary measure, relatively straightforward. But what happens when you start applying social impact bonds and the payment by results mechanisms underneath them? What starts happening when you start applying those things to issues like obesity? Yep. Again, we don't just need your help in terms of empiricism sort of angle, in terms of counting it. We need your help in terms of thinking about theory, about political economy. Yeah? About some of the moral issues that underpin these changes to the voluntary sector economy. It's not all bad, and some of it has actually been around for quite a long time. So this is a poster from 1919, a charity called Talbot House, or Tok H, that basically was saying the best way you can help us isn't to give us money, it's to lend us money. So where are the historians who are looking at voluntary sector that can help us think about some of this stuff from the past and can help us think about what did we do before. It strikes me that one of the challenges of the voluntary sector studies research community is that it's drawn from a relatively narrow number of disciplines. It's predominantly social policy and sociology. I'd like to see more historians involved. I'd like to see more management discipline, more economists involved, especially for things like social impact bonds and social investment. But it's not just about big institutions in terms of the changing voluntary sector economy. I'd also suggest that we need your help in terms of understanding people's changing attitudes about money and about impact. And I'd suggest to you that the generation that sort of the millennials that started work in the 2000s, that they've changed from what you might call a more altruistic mindset to much more of an investor type mindset. And I think we need help in understanding that. There's research going on in the US about the millennial generation and their attitudes to charities. We don't have that same sort of research here in the UK. This is an organisation called Lend With Care. It's an advert for Lend With Care. It's a microfinance organisation. My wife panic bought me a gorilla onesie. I wish she'd bought me a Lend With Care gift voucher instead. Okay, it's a joke, but if you were to look to the US and look at Kiva, has anyone come across Kiva? No. Look at KIVA. Look at Kiva in the US. It is fundamentally changing the way that we think about social outcomes and the way that we support communities. And I think we're going to see the same here in the UK. And I think we need, again, help in understanding how that's going to play out. It's good, whether it's bad. The issue about marketisation is something that we also need your help in understanding. If we're moving from a gift economy to more of a market economy in the sector, what are the implications of that? We have social enterprises here in the UK. We've seen the establishment of KICs, or community interest companies. If you remember that chart I showed you before about how the voluntary sector had stagnated in this country sort of over the last 4 or 5 years, the number of new charities registered has been relatively static over that same time, so the sector is not growing in terms of the number of organisations. But over that same time period, over I think about 5 or 6 years, the number of community interest companies, or KICs, has, from a standing start of nothing, has gone to 11,000 organisations. What's driving that? Do people not think that charity anymore is the best vehicle to achieve social outcomes? I hear lots of stuff all the time now about how business practices, business mechanisms, actually, forget that, businesses are the best vehicles to achieve social outcomes. Is that true? Is that just policy and ideology? We need your help. And people do have a problem with institutions. This is another US organisation called Give Directly. This is also part of that technology piece that I talked about before. This is an organisation that is trying to identify individuals, families in Rwanda, so that you can give directly to those individuals and disintermediate the traditional voluntary sector. Yeah? Is that boundary that I talked about before, that blurring of boundaries between our sector and individuals? I'm not quite sure what it is, but I know it's changing. Next challenge is about public services, which I've sort of broadly talked on just before. I realise I've probably got about 10 minutes left. Yep. So I'll rattle on. If we're right about what's going to happen in the budget next week, and if we're right about demographic change, this is going to be the area where I think more and more and more will be expected of voluntary organisations, but especially volunteering. I think not just those people perhaps on the right of the centre who do want to roll back the state, but also those people on the left of the centre as well. They're still very interested in this narrative about how do we get individuals and communities to do more for themselves. Yeah? I think the sort of the right of centre version of that is that sort of Samuel Smiles narrative about individual self-help. How can we just get individuals to, via vouchers, to become better purchasers and so on? How do we develop public service markets? But on the left of the centre, I still think they want communities to do more, but it's about social action much more. It's about people coming together. It's about voluntary organisations and intermediate institutions. But how we do this, I don't know. We have got some evidence that says that grant funding to the sector is falling. What's work from Nick's team that just released that I think surprised us is that contract income for the delivery of services is now also falling. It's fallen for 2 years in a row. And we can go to the likes of government and the National Audit Office and we can talk about how public service markets are not working, about how there's this constant trend towards larger and larger contracts being handed out to a smaller number of organisations. Yeah? And then the challenge that we get back from policymakers is, well, we don't know if voluntary organisations are actually any better at delivering services, so why should we bother doing something different or special? You come to us, you people in the voluntary sector, and you talk about early intervention. You talk about added value and broader social outcomes. Where's your evidence? And we're struggling. We need your help. I talked about payment by results already, but we know from what was in the manifestos that the predominant vision of how you deliver public services now will be using payment by results mechanisms. Yeah? I think we need more help in terms of critiquing that, because it's not as good as it might first appear, even though how you explain that to the public at large, I don't know. But also, for where organisations do want to engage with those sorts of mechanisms, they need help from, I'd say, researchers in measuring their outcomes. So again, it's a plea for engagement. So good examples are, if you've come across social prescribing, this is a social prescribing project in Gloucester called Artlift, where they've got cost-benefit analysis that shows basically if somebody spends a week with an artist and learns how to paint, they're less likely to visit the GP afterwards with depression than if you prescribe them with citalopram. We need more examples like that to prove our point, which is why we look to you. The single biggest thing that policymakers are interested in at the moment isn't the voluntary sector, it's volunteering. And I think that they look at those public services challenges and they think that trying to increase volunteering both in the public services, but also the more enlightened ones are thinking about volunteering outside the public services, and they're thinking about social capital. And they're thinking about how do we build the resilience of communities by getting people to engage with each other more. Everything that I've seen in terms of the Community Life Survey and its predecessor, the Citizenship Survey, would suggest that levels of formal and informal volunteering are very stable. I hear lots about the fact that underpinning those very stable levels is our dependence upon a civic core of predominantly older, middle class people who give a vast proportion of the hours in terms of volunteering, but also in terms of philanthropy and charitable giving as well. But again, I'm seeing lots of anecdotal evidence that things are changing and that the next generation, the millennials and the Gen Z, they're not interested in the sort of volunteering that the civic core were interested in. I think policy making and practice is all about how do we increase the supply? How do we get more people? I'll start foaming at the mouth as well in a minute. How do we get more people into the funnel? Yeah? When actually, I think what we need help from you doing is understanding much more about what are people's motivations around volunteering. How have they changed? Yeah? Is it all going to be about service delivery and the uniform type charities, the Step Up to Serves and the National Citizen Service? Is that the sort of volunteering that the millennials want? Or is it something different? Will it still be about conviviality? Yeah? And also, what are the models of people's volunteering as we shift from that civic core model to something that's much more informal, much more flexible, more short-term, possibly distant, so not in situ. So the sort of micro-volunteering that Nick and IVR and his team have done some work on. This is one of my other examples of the blurring of the boundaries. It's the Canal and River Trust. Anyone know what that used to be called? It's the British Waterways Board. It used to be part of the state. Okay. Here you have a big, lumbering statutory organisation that has been charitised. In Volunteers Week, volunteering is at front and centre of what they're about. It's what every policymaker, I think, is thinking about at the moment in terms of public services. But I don't think they've got an evidence base to actually support intelligent policy making on this. Yeah? If you were to ask me at the minute how many people volunteer in the public services and in the different bits of the public services, I don't think we could tell you. I don't think we could, therefore, tell you in 2 years' time about whether policy is making a difference and whether there's a change. So even some quite basic stuff we need help on. So policies, there's the big manifesto commitment about volunteering is that if you work in a big public sector organisation or a big private sector organisation, you'll get 3 days a year to volunteer where you will grow and turn into a blooming volunteer. What's the evidence that that's needed? What's the evidence that that will work? Nick, I don't know if we've got that yet, but it strikes me that we've got to go into conversations with policymakers pretty soon and try and talk to them about that. But we've also, again, got to come back to this issue about business. I don't think the government thinks we're that good. And actually, I think it thinks that business is potentially as good as, or a better vehicle for social action than many voluntary organisations are at the minute. So again, as we're thinking and talking and being told all the time to develop relationships between the voluntary sector and business, to blur those boundaries, what will that do to our values? What will that do to the way that we operate? What are the implications of that for business as well? Is it a good thing? Is it a bad thing? What should we think about the fact that the relationship with business has changed significantly from one where large amounts of cash were handed over once a year to instead one that's much more about shared value, the Michael Porter agenda? What can you do to help us understand that? This is Timpsons, if you don't know. Timpsons employ ex-offenders to work in their heel bars. And if you roll up outside Timpsons and you're unemployed and you need your suit cleaning, they'll clean it for you. That doesn't strike me as vastly different to what some voluntary organisations are doing. But we tend to think that business is just bad. This is also where I think government is really interested in volunteering again. This is Incredible Edible in Todmorden, if you haven't come across Incredible Edible. They've tried to disrupt sort of the way that the local authority is thinking by just putting planters in railway stations and growing vegetables and seeds. They do it on the front steps of the town hall as well. And interestingly, when they wrote a book about how they did it, they didn't go to a charitable foundation and ask for £10,000 to write the book and the project. They crowdfunded it. They used Kickstarter, and they found 1,000 people that each put £10 in. Again, I'm not saying that that's good or bad, but it's an indicator of how our sector is changing and where it's going, and we need you to help us understand that. I'm probably running out of time, aren't I? Right. Transparency. I've talked far too much. I'm going to finish on this. This is my sort of good and bad charities thing. I guess many of you will be familiar with the Olive Cook story. At the minute. Okay, that story has sort of moved on. But I think where we do need research, particularly at the minute, is to almost sort of go back to first principles and think about what are we for? Why do people trust charities? Why should they trust charities? And what is it about us, about our values and our way of working that's different? Because if we are in a world where the boundaries are blurring, we probably need to think about purpose and distinctiveness more than ever.